Now, Tillerson's ouster certainly isn't the only big news out of Washington today. The Trump administration continues to make waves with all kinds of potential ripple effects for the global economy. American chipmaker Qualcomm's shares fell today. Investors reacted to the president blocking a takeover from rival Broadcom yesterday. Trump says there were security concerns over that merger and how it would give China the upper hand in the mobile arms race. At $117 billion, it would have been the biggest tech deal ever. Then, of course, there are those steel and aluminum tariffs announced earlier this month. Trump's Treasury Secretary says there may be a way for countries to avoid them. Steve Mnuchin says the president may ask NATO members to contribute more money. To help us digest these latest moves of President Trump, we're joined by Besma Momani, Senior Fellow at Waterloo's Center for International Governance Innovation. Certainly is good to see you. And there's an awful lot to unpack here. If we can start with the tying of these steel and aluminum tariffs to NATO spending, is there any wisdom in that? What do you make of that?
It's frankly odd. This is not how trade negotiations are done. Not only is, I think, Secretary Mnuchin mistaken, something that he's repeated Trump several times, which is this idea that one contributes to NATO funding. There's no such thing. It's about spending on defense. The goal of NATO has always been 2%. Indeed, Canada has fallen short of that. But, you know, again, Canada punches above its weight in sort of contributing to NATO. It's not all about defense spending. It's about the quality. I remember you have a country like Greece that spends, 4% of their GDP on defense. You can't compare our contribution to NATO like that of Greece's. So I think it's really arbitrary, this 2%. But again, I think it speaks volumes to how, confused the U.S. administration is about how the international system works.
Do you think, though, that there are any countries? I mean, I've reported so much on Canada and that exact notion that we punch way above our weight in our contribution, what we do in Afghanistan and around the world. But are there other countries, do you think, that might say, oh, I don't know, sure, maybe if we do up a little bit of spending, we can avoid these tariffs, and that'll help us in terms of being able to build malls and whatever else we need steel for?
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, if you're looking at the countries that are sort of below that 2% threshold, they're not the ones that are really worried about the steel tariffs. I mean, if we think about the main key partners for the United States, it's Canada, Mexico, and Brazil. And Brazil is probably the one country most worried about the steel tariffs now that Canada and Mexico have this sort of exemption. And to be honest with you, what's really weird about this, to add layers to it, is that, Brazil is the largest importer of coal, American coal. And so as the Americans apply this 25% tariff on steel, you're going to have the Brazilians basically say, great, we're going to do the same thing on coal. Now, the coal industry employs far more people than the U.S. steel industry. I mean, it just shows you how complex this is, and I'm afraid the U.S. administration doesn't see the layers of complexity in all of these negotiations.
The other development we've seen on this file is Canada reacting to the allegation that China is dumping steel here in Canada to sort of effectively lower the North American cost of steel. And we've heard from as high up as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that they plan to do something about it. On that first, how important is that? Is China, in fact, dumping steel in Canada?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised that they are. Obviously, the North American market is really lucrative, and as continues the Americans to shut them out, they're going to look for alternate buyers. And some of that may, in fact, go through Canada into the United States. But I think it also says a lot, Prime Minister Trudeau's statement today says a lot about the fact that, our trade negotiations with China has kind of soured. We haven't seen that progress very quickly. Our signing with the TPP-11 is a sign that we're, finding new partners in the Asia Pacific. So I think things are definitely rocky on the whole international trade front. And frankly, all of the new folks that are coming into the U.S. administration, the departure of Gary Cohen, and even perhaps Pompeo as the new Secretary of State, these are all protectionist, hawkish people. So it doesn't bode well for the international trade system for sure.
I was reading protectionist Twitter today, and they were all saying, look, if we can even get Canada to address the China stuff a little bit, and maybe one country even potentially looks at their NATO spending, then all of this, the tariff tactic, has been a huge success. Is there some truth to that?
Well, I mean, that's always been, Donald Trump's MO. It's been about trying to, sow chaos. And out of that chaos, you sort of move the needle forward a little bit. But I'm afraid all these other things that get lost don't get counted, which is, loss of faith, the uncertainty, obviously the stock market, gyrating based on his actions and reactions. And also there's consequences of jobs and investment. I mean, the fact that we don't have certainty makes a lot of companies worried. So I don't think it works in the long run. Might work in a real estate deal, but doesn't work in international trade.
Good stuff as always, Besma. Thanks for this. Besma Momani, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation.